Operation Carnivore. When Britain's Secret War Service trained rats as living incendiaries. The morning of December 12, 1943, arrives cold and gray over rural Hertfordshire. At a nondescript Ministry of Supply facility near Ware, a scientist named William Buckland removes a small laboratory rat from its cage with practiced care. The animal has been conditioned over weeks with electrical stimuli and food rewards. Today, the final test will determine whether Operation Carnivore, one of the most audacious and bizarre schemes of the Second World War, can actually work. In a specially designed miniature harness, a small explosive device of incendiary composition has been fitted to the rat's body. The weight is negligible for the animal's physiology, but the intention is revolutionary. This rat will be dropped deep into the enemy heartland, where it will scurry through the ventilation systems of German factories, ignite on a time delay, and cause catastrophic fires that precision bombing had failed to achieve. The question was no longer whether such a thing could theoretically occur, but whether Britain's war planners would really bet scarce resources on the mad notion that rodents could solve the strategic bombing problem. War has a way of making the impossible seem necessary. By late 1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had proven frustratingly inefficient. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces combined had dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance across German territory. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions of civilians had been killed or displaced. And yet German industrial production continued to climb. The armament factories, synthetic fuel plants, and ball-bearing works that sustained Hitler's war machine proved remarkably resilient to conventional bombing. Security measures had improved dramatically. Smoke screens, decoy facilities, underground production lines, and ruthlessly relocated manufacturing had made precision bombing increasingly elusive. One factory dispersed across 100 locations was harder to destroy than one concentrated target. Estimates suggested that the average bomber required over 400 sorties to destroy a single factory completely. The mathematics of strategic bombing, once optimistically presented to political leaders, had become nightmarishly unfavorable. For every aircraft lost, the damage inflicted seemed marginal. The cost in aircrew lives was unsustainable. The War Office and the Special Operations Executive, the shadowy organization responsible for sabotage and irregular warfare, began casting about for alternatives. If you could not destroy factories with conventional air power, perhaps you could destroy them from within. The idea was not entirely novel. SOE had been dropping agents and weapons into occupied Europe for years, but the notion of biological delivery systems was. In 1943, several concepts were seriously entertained. There was discussion of using pigeons fitted with incendiary devices. There was consideration of specially trained dogs. But it was the rat that captured the imagination of certain planners, particularly those who understood rodent behavior. Rats infested nearly every large building in Europe, and they were nocturnal creatures that naturally sought the warmth of engines and machinery. They nested in ventilation systems. They understood the subterranean architecture of industrial plants better than any human saboteur could. What if this natural advantage could be weaponized? What if a rat could be conditioned to deliver destruction rather than merely cause accidental mischief? The technical solution emerged from the scientific facilities of the Ministry of Supply and the Special Operations Executive's research sections. The device itself was ingenious in its simplicity. A small incendiary charge, approximately 30 grams of thermite and chemical accelerants, was housed in a thin aluminum case designed to withstand the rat's movement without crushing the delicate components. The charge was triggered by a clockwork mechanism powered by a small spring, set to ignite between 12 and 48 hours after deployment, allowing sufficient time for the rat to be dropped, transported, and released near its target facility. The harness was constructed from lightweight webbing that could be fitted to the rat without restricting its movement. The explosive chamber mounted snugly against the animal's body without impairing its ability to climb, squeeze through gaps, or navigate the tortuous passages of an industrial building. The incendiary itself was deliberately designed to burn at an exceptionally high temperature, over 1,000 degrees Celsius, not to create a massive explosion, but to ignite whatever combustible materials lay nearby. Stored petrol, oil-soaked machinery components, wooden structural elements, textile goods in storage, any of these would sustain and spread the initial fire created by the rat's hidden cargo. The conditioning process was perhaps even more remarkable than the device itself. Behavioral scientists working for the Ministry of Supply established that rats could be trained using Pavlovian methods to respond to specific stimuli. Through careful application of electrical stimulation and food rewards, handlers discovered they could encourage rats to enter dark spaces and confined areas that they would naturally avoid. More significantly, they could be taught to move purposefully through unfamiliar environments rather than freeze with fear. The program was conducted at the Waltham Abbey complex, where several hundred rats were obtained and subjected to intensive training regimens. The process took weeks for each animal. Handlers would condition the rats within simulated factory environments, replica ventilation shafts, mock machinery spaces, false industrial building sections, to familiarize them with the kind of structures they would eventually encounter. The rats were starved slightly and then rewarded with food upon completion of each training stage. Some rats proved more amenable to the conditioning than others. Roughly 70% of those that entered the program reached the stage where they could be reliably predicted to navigate a complex structure in darkness. The remaining 30% had to be discarded as unsuitable. By early 1944, over 300 rats had been trained and were deemed operationally ready, their conditioning maintained through regular reinforcement exercises. The first planned operational deployment was nothing short of extraordinary. The target was Germany's Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of the Reich, where the massive Krupp steelworks and Thyssen plants controlled a significant portion of German armament production. The plan was elaborate and dangerous. RAF Lancaster bombers, which would already be flying missions into the region, would carry specially designed containers holding the trained incendiary-equipped rats. On the return leg of their bombing run, they would release these containers at low altitude over the target area, where they would parachute down with small silencing mechanisms that prevented the descent from panicking the animals. Once on the ground, the rats would emerge from their containers into the industrial landscape they had been trained to navigate. Factory workers, they hoped, would assume these were simply vermin that had infested the facility, which in a sense they were. But within the predetermined time window, the incendiary devices would activate, starting fires in the very heart of German industrial capacity. Conservative estimates suggested that even a 30% success rate, with only 100 rats igniting successfully, could cause sufficient damage to warrant the effort. The psychological warfare value of the operation was almost equally important to the physical destruction anticipated. German factory managers and workers would find themselves unable to distinguish between accident, sabotage by human agents, and natural infestation. The presence of incendiary-bearing rats would mean that factories could not be secured, that no space was safe from enemy attack, that vigilance against invisible enemies was required at every moment. If word leaked, and the Nazis would certainly publicize such an operation once discovered, the psychological impact would be profound. British forces possessed such technological sophistication that they could train animals to carry weapons. Nowhere was truly secure. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. We've got plenty more stories like this where we explore the strange weapons and stranger schemes of the Second World War, so do press that button to stay updated. The operational deployment of Operation Carnivore, however, remained largely theoretical. Records indicate that at least one test drop was conducted, possibly over Germany in the spring of 1944, though the precise location and results remain classified or lost to history. What is known is that the operation appears to have been canceled in June 1944, shortly after the D-Day landings. The official reasons for discontinuation are unclear. Surviving documents speak vaguely of resource constraints and the need to prioritize conventional operations. Some historians suggest that the project's overseer, Christopher Strachey, and other senior figures in the SOE's technical section argued that the operation's success rate was too unpredictable and its potential for generating propaganda that could be used against Britain too high. Others point to the simple fact that the operation's logical foundation, that German factories remained vulnerable to a novel method of attack, was increasingly undermined by the success of strategic bombing campaigns. By mid-1944, with control of the air secured, conventional bombing was inflicting increasingly severe damage on German industry. The exotic option no longer seemed necessary. If we compare Operation Carnivore to German attempts at similar biological or exotic warfare delivery, the contrast is illuminating. Nazi Germany had considered various schemes involving animals, including the ludicrous notion of deploying large mammals wearing explosives, but nothing that achieved the sophistication of the British rat program. The Germans did, however, pursue biological warfare research more extensively than Britain, experiments that remain morally repugnant. The American program produced nothing directly comparable, though the United States military did explore animal-based devices for other purposes. What distinguished the British approach was not necessarily superior technology, but rather superior discipline in animal behavior science. The Germans approached the problem mechanically. The British understood animal psychology. This difference, marginal though it might have seemed, separated a program that might actually function from one that would almost certainly fail. The impact of Operation Carnivore on the war's actual course was negligible in material terms. No evidence suggests that the rats ever successfully deployed in sufficient numbers to cause measurable damage to German industry. The operation was canceled before achieving operational status in any significant way. Yet the program's existence reveals something profound about the nature of industrial warfare and the desperation that consumed even the most technologically advanced Allied powers. When conventional methods proved insufficient, Britain's planners turned to increasingly unconventional means. They did not blanch at absurdity if absurdity might offer operational advantage. The rats represented a willingness to pursue any avenue of attack, however improbable. In that sense, the psychological impact the operation was designed to inflict on German forces became real, but only retrospectively, when the Germans learned, or later when historians discovered, the scheme they had narrowly escaped. The surviving artifacts from Operation Carnivore are few and scattered. The Ministry of Supply facilities where the rats were trained were largely destroyed by bombing or disposed of after the war. No surviving rats remain naturally. The incendiary devices themselves were produced in small numbers, and any existing examples are held in classified archives or have been lost entirely. What remains is testimony from the few scientists and military personnel who participated in the program, along with scattered documentation in the National Archives and the SOE's surviving records. This fragmentary evidence has allowed historians to piece together the operation's outlines, though countless details remain unknowable. The exact success rate of the conditioning program remains unclear. The precise performance characteristics of the incendiary device have never been fully declassified. The full extent of operational deployment remains speculative. December 1943 had seemed to those planners gathered around William Buckland's laboratory to offer genuine possibility. Here, at last, was a weapon that the Germans could not easily defend against because they would not easily believe it. A soldier with a gun could be stopped. An airplane could be shot down. An agent could be captured and interrogated. But a rat? How does one defend against a rat that carries hidden fire? It seemed, for a brief moment in that wartime December, that the Allies had discovered a form of attack that transcended conventional military logic. Yet, when the moment passed and conventional logic reasserted itself, when bombers grew more numerous, their accuracy improved, when conventional sources of advantage multiplied, The rats of Operation Carnivore faded into obscurity. They remained, in the end, what they had always been: ingenious misdirection, the product of desperate times and inventive minds, a reminder that war makes planners consider paths they might otherwise never contemplate. The rats never set German factories ablaze, but they had lived in the imagination of the war planners, creatures of possibility, in an age that seemed increasingly impossible to navigate through conventional means. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is not the one that kills, but the one that whispers, "What if?" in the ear of those who must choose which battles to fight and which dreams to pursue.